See it in Dubai.
Explain to me what's good right now. Explain to me right now as we sit here what's good for the American public.
We want to do business in growing jurisdictions. We want to sell stuff to people where their economies are growing. That's
you just said a bunch of nothing.
Years.
Like, explain to me right now, somebody who lives in South Carolina, Nebraska, Ohio, what is good right now for the American public going into a war where you do not understand that they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz? Explain to somebody watching right now where they're from.
This war is 78 days
So you
old.
don't have an answer. Just say
I have a 100% answer.
What's the answer?
You make stuff in North Carolina, you make stuff in South Carolina, you have to sell it to somebody. You want to ship it to countries where they can afford it, where they make a lot of money, where the income per capita is very high. That's what the Middle East has.
You can't sell me a bunch of BS.
Can I tell you something?
Bakari Sellers calls out Kevin O'Leary on CNN for sounding completely out of touch. After everything that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, people have become far more doubtful of politicians and TV commentators who speak with total confidence about foreign policy, especially when even a brief disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could send gas prices soaring, damage farmers, and push inflation even higher for everyday Americans. So let's get into it and watch how Bakari Sellers completely shuts Kevin O'Leary down during this heated CNN debate.
The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. And actually, today, Iran released this website that says, "Welcome to the Persian Gulf Strait Authority." They are asserting control over the strait. They're setting up an entity that would allow them to do things like collect tolls, to manage the inflows and outflows. I mean, this is a different world than we were in before, and that can have profound impacts on the global economy.
It's just social media. It's irrelevant. And the way I look at it and why this outcome probably is going to work out is the alignment in the Middle East has changed forever. There was a time only 70 days ago when the countries around Iran would not take issue with them, considering them to be in the circle of friendship, so to speak. They showed their colors by bombing all their neighbors. They weren't successful, but they caused a lot of economic damage, data centers, oil refineries. Those countries, UAE specifically, which took so much of the brunt because it's so close to the U.S., are forever aligned with the United States now, period. So whatever deal is going to happen, it's going to be with an understanding that odd man out in perpetuity is this rogue country where you've got a militia of 250,000 people. You've got to pay them to kill people, so you can't cut off their oil forever. And right now, every day they lose $210 million. So there's two ways to tenderize Iran. Shut down the strait so they can't get their oil out, squeeze their cash so they can't pay the murderers that are in there. Because remember, there's 92 million people, good people. There's a million army controlled by 250,000 paid thug murderers, militia. That's how it works. Now, you cut off that money, the thugs don't get paid. They don't kill anybody anymore. Then maybe you can get a change. But whatever happens from this point on,
be in a different place, though,
it's just the way it is.
Because,
That's a fact.
I think that your presentation of it sounds nice and straightforward. But the reality the reality is that we're dealing with an ideological regime. And we're dealing with an ideological regime that's controlled by the people with the guns. And those people, despite all the economic pressure, contrary to what you are saying, have not backed down. That's why we're in this predicament. Because Trump is talking to some people, but the guys with the guns keep saying no deal.
Listen, I genuinely want the United States to succeed. I don't want us to have gone through all of this hell for the last few months to end up in a worse place than where Obama had left us. And I want it to be over quickly. I consume an inordinate amount of news on a daily basis. I can't keep up with what's going on because I feel like you wake up in the morning, you read something in the newspaper, then by mid-morning, the White House spokesperson or Hegseth or Rubio have come out and said this thing is over. 2 hours later, Trump is tweeting the opposite. And then in the middle of the night, he'll wake up and he'll tweet out some sort of meme that makes absolutely no sense. In the meantime, you've got the Iranians giving him playing from the same hymnal, doing memes of Legos and tweeting things out on social media. I feel like I have heard, I don't know how many times now in the last, 2.5, 3 months that this war is almost over, that we are close to a deal. I hope we are close to a deal, but at this point, until I see that deal, I don't know what we're talking about.
History has proven again and again that situations like this are never as simple as putting on pressure and expecting a regime to suddenly collapse. Iran's government has already survived decades of sanctions, economic isolation, internal unrest, and non-stop international pressure. Governments built around strong ideology often care more about holding on to power than improving the economy, especially when military groups have major influence inside the country. And the Strait of Hormuz situation alone is incredibly serious. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through that area. So even short-term instability there can send oil prices jumping across the globe, raise shipping costs, and make inflation even worse for ordinary people far beyond the Middle East. That means higher gas prices, more expensive groceries, and rising fertilizer costs that end up hurting both farmers and everyday consumers. So when some commentators brush aside those risks too casually, a lot of viewers naturally become concerned. Another thing that really stood out was the growing frustration over how inconsistent the messaging around this conflict has become. One day, officials claim negotiations are close. The next day, someone says the complete opposite. And then social media throws even more confusion into the mix. That uncertainty matters because markets, allies, and the public all react differently when there's no clear strategy being communicated. And honestly, after Iraq and Afghanistan, Americans are far less willing to blindly believe overly optimistic predictions about foreign policy. People still remember being told those wars would be quick, targeted, and necessary, only for them to drag on for years while costing trillions of dollars and destabilizing entire regions. That's why Abby and Anna's skepticism connected with so many viewers. It wasn't about supporting Iran or rooting against America. It was about understanding that complicated geopolitical conflicts almost never play out cleanly, and pretending they do is exactly how countries end up trapped in situations they can't easily get out of.
President is not sending that message to the American people. Every day he wakes up and he's like, we're almost getting a deal. And if you believe that, which I think at this point you should know better, but if you do believe that, then I think you will be surprised when it probably doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in 48 hours or 72 hours or 10 days or whatever timeline he has decided to put on it.
Yeah, I don't know when it's going to end. I don't know when they're going to come to their senses. I mean, look, eventually the president's going to have to decide what the timeline is on his patience. I think he's showing some restraint right now and some patience with them. I mean, they have kind of violated the ceasefire. They've sent these little boats out and they've fired on our partners in the Middle East. The president has showed restraint because I think he believes in the diplomatic process that's going on. I agree with Shermichael. It may take some time.
Should he level with the American people about truly how long this could take? And if it does take a long time, how long we could be living with a global economy that's being held hostage by Iran?
I mean, the truth is he probably doesn't know, A, because, we're dealing with a fractured government, and B, we're dealing with folks here who, let's be honest, aren't the best faith operators. And so I think, look, however this ends and whenever it ends, one thing has to be true. Complete and total victory, which comes in the form of saying they will never have a nuclear weapon. Whenever he gets to that point, then it will be a success.
Does never mean a 10-year timeline.
If it's 10 years or 15 years for you, that's not complete victory?
Well, what I read today was that there would be a moratorium of maybe 15 years, and that the Iranians would also agree to send their 970 pounds of enriched uranium to the United States, and that they would promise to not pursue any weaponization. If those three things happen, that's victory.
But I would just say quickly, Abby, to your point about the rise in oil prices, you talked about this, Bakari. I mean, a part of having a 30-day ceasefire is in those negotiations, you're going to, I assume, argue for them to open up the Strait of Hormuz, because it is going to take at least 90 days. Maybe even longer to see oil prices begin to drop again. And so that has to be a part of that negotiations until you get to an ultimate
Why was that not? Can somebody explain to me like I'm a fifth grader?
These kinds of diplomatic negotiations almost never move fast. The original Iran nuclear deal took years of talks involving several countries, intelligence agencies, inspectors, and private back-channel negotiations before anything was finally agreed on. So when politicians keep throwing out overly hopeful timelines every few days, people naturally become doubtful when reality fails to match the messaging. What also gets ignored is how much uncertainty alone can damage the global economy. Around 20% of the world's oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz, And even short-term instability there can quickly drive up oil futures, shipping costs, and insurance rates. That pressure eventually reaches ordinary people through higher gas prices, more expensive food, airfare increases, and rising inflation. Farmers usually get hit especially hard because fertilizer and transportation costs climb alongside energy prices. Another important point Abby was indirectly making is that ideological governments do not always react to pressure the way Western leaders expect them to. History has shown that sanctions and economic isolation can hurt economies without forcing quick political change. Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran itself have all survived long periods of pressure while keeping the same core power structure in place. That is why many foreign policy experts warn against assuming that maximum pressure automatically leads to fast concessions. And honestly, after Iraq and Afghanistan, Americans are much more careful about promises of quick solutions. People remember hearing timelines before. They remember being told conflicts would be limited and almost over, only for those wars to drag on for years while costing trillions of dollars. That is why Abby's argument connected with so many viewers. It was not about rooting against America or wanting diplomacy to fail. It was about asking for realistic expectations, honest communication, and an understanding that these geopolitical conflicts are far more complicated than politicians and commentators often make them sound less complex.
Like, why was the shutting off of the Strait of Hormuz not actually something that Pete Hegseth and the rest of them thought about prior to?
Am I supposed to know?
I'm just asking. Explain it to me, please.
Because the Strait of Hormuz is how Iran gets income.
We know that part.
So
no, but his question,
my question is, why did we not anticipate them shutting it off? Like, if you're going to war with somebody...
didn't. I have no idea. The strategy was to go in there and change the dynamics in perpetuity. No question. After
so we didn't know what the hell we were doing.
I guarantee you two things. Before this is worked out, the strait will be open and probably policed by people around that region because it's in their best interest. And secondly, there are no friends in the world left for Iran. Maybe you could call China in.
China.
Maybe you could call Russia. But these are rogue nations. And what Trump has done, whether you like it or you don't, he's changed the axis of power there. Because at the end of the day, this is good for that region. That region has such potential and growth, and you could see it in Dubai.
Explain to me what's good right now. Explain to me right now as we sit here what's good for the American public.
We want to do business in growing jurisdictions. We want to sell stuff to people where their economies are growing. That's
you just said a bunch of nothing.
Years.
Like, explain to me right now, somebody who lives in South Carolina, Nebraska, Ohio, what is good right now for the American public going into a war where you do not understand that they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz? Explain to somebody watching right now where they're from.
This war is 78 days
So you don't have an answer. Just say
I have a 100% answer.
What's the answer?
You make stuff in North Carolina, you make stuff in South Carolina, you have to sell it to somebody. You want to ship it to countries where they can afford it, where they make a lot of money, where the income per capita is very high. That's what the Middle East has.
You can't sell me a bunch of BS.
Can I tell you something?
Still BS here.
Kevin, the farmer in North Carolina who was not able to secure fertilizer for their planting crops right now is not going to have a short-term answer.
They won't have to solve that problem in 24 hours? You just take the tariff off potash.
You raised a good topic, which is short-term versus long-term. And I grant you, there will be people who look at this as a short-term, painful experience. What the president has said, though, is, look, I just cannot permit, after all these years, after 47 years of these people being at war with us and Western civilization, I cannot permit them to get to a place where they have a nuclear weapon. And over the long term, our children and our grandchildren will thank us when we take that away from them. So it is a good debating topic, short versus long term. The president here has a long-term thought, which is he can't let these people have
there's such a huge number of farmers declaring bankruptcy right now. And if I were a farmer in America, I'd be asking myself, why the hell did we send $40 billion to bail out Argentina and nobody's helping us out?
That was a credit swap and we made money on it.
Sure, Michael, you were
going to say. I was just going to say
quickly,
that
to the farmers.
Bakari is raising a very legitimate question about the immediate versus the long term. I mean, in terms of immediate, I don't have an answer that will be satisfactory to most people who are struggling out there. To me, in the long run, I'm looking at stabilization in the region. I'm also looking at China, which has been a big focal point for me. They get 14% of their oil reserves from Iran. They are our number one adversary globally. I think any opportunity the United States can diminish that is critically important for our hegemony over the next 50 to 100 years. That's a long-term answer, but a very valid one.
All right. Well, the thing I'm looking for is, can they actually get a deal? Because at the end of the day, Iran's big play has been for many decades just to keep talking. Yeah. And they'd love to just keep talking until the cows come home. But will they actually sign on the dotted line is the big question for this White House.
Bakari Sellers was asking what was probably the most practical question in the entire discussion. What does any of this actually do right now for ordinary people already struggling with rising prices, debt, and economic uncertainty? It is easy for politicians and television commentators to talk about long-term strategy and reshaping power in the Middle East. But regular Americans are not living in the long term. They are living paycheck to paycheck. And the Strait of Hormuz situation is not some small detail people can casually ignore. Around 20% of global oil shipments move through that narrow waterway, and even the threat of disruption there can send oil prices climbing almost immediately. That means higher gas prices, more expensive shipping, rising fertilizer costs, and higher food prices for ordinary families. Farmers usually get hit especially hard because fertilizer production depends heavily on natural gas and global energy markets. So when Bakari talks about struggling farmers in places like North Carolina or across the Midwest, that is a very real concern, not just another political talking point. Another thing that stood out was how nobody really had a clear answer for why the possible economic fallout seemed so under-discussed beforehand. Historically, major conflicts in the Middle East have almost always affected global energy markets. We saw it during the oil crises in the 1970s, the Gulf War, Iraq, and even during smaller regional escalations. Economists have warned for decades that instability around the Persian Gulf creates ripple effects throughout the global economy. And honestly, Americans are far more skeptical now after Iraq and Afghanistan. People have heard promises before about conflicts bringing stability, democracy, or long-term strategic success. Meanwhile, the Costs of War Project at Brown University estimated that post-9/11 wars cost the United States more than $8 trillion. Because of that, many Americans look at crumbling infrastructure, rising housing costs, expensive health care, and struggling farmers at home, and wonder why there always seems to be unlimited money available for geopolitical projects overseas.